Captain Maria Santos adjusted her helmet one final time as she walked across the rain-soaked tarmac at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. The wind whipped around her, carrying the scent of approaching storm clouds that had been building all morning. At 28 years old, she had earned her place as one of the most skilled Apache helicopter pilots in the 101st Airborne Division. But today felt different. Today, the whispers followed her more closely than usual. "There she goes again," muttered Sergeant Williams from behind a maintenance truck. "Another glory-seeking mission for the woman who thinks she can fly through anything." Maria had heard variations of this comment countless times over her 6-year military career. Being one of only 12 female Apache pilots in active duty meant every flight, every decision, every success, and failure was scrutinized under a microscope that her male counterparts never experienced. The betting pool about when she would finally crack under pressure had started during her first deployment to Afghanistan. Some soldiers wagered she would wash out during her first real combat mission. Others bet she would break during advanced training exercises. None of them expected her to not only survive, but excel in every challenge thrown her way. The morning briefing had been tense. Hurricane Delilah was approaching the Gulf Coast with unprecedented speed and intensity. What started as a Category 2 storm had rapidly intensified into a Category 4 monster, with sustained winds of 145 miles per hour and gusts reaching 180. Emergency evacuation orders have been issued for 3 coastal counties in Louisiana, but communication with remote oil rig platforms had been cut for over 6 hours. Colonel Harrison stood at the front of the briefing room, his weathered face grave as he outlined the situation. Platform Delta, 7 houses 43, crew members who missed the evacuation window. Their emergency beacon activated 2 hours ago, but we've lost all radio contact. Weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly, and conventional rescue operations are impossible. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Flying any aircraft in hurricane force winds was considered suicide by most pilots. The combination of unpredictable wind shears, lightning strikes, and near-zero visibility made it a mission that violated every safety protocol in the book. "We need a volunteer for reconnaissance," the colonel continued, scanning the room filled with experienced pilots. "Someone needs to locate the platform, assess the situation, and determine if evacuation is possible before conditions worsen further." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Even the most experienced pilots, men who had flown countless combat missions in Iraq and Afghanistan, exchanged uncertain glances. Flying into a hurricane was beyond dangerous. It was a calculated risk that bordered on madness. Maria felt every eye in the room turn toward her when she raised her hand. The betting pool had always assumed she would eventually face a situation where her gender would become a liability. This was that moment, according to the whispered conversations she pretended not to hear. "Captain Santos," Colonel Harrison acknowledged, though his expression remained skeptical. "You understand the risks involved?" "Yes, sir. I've reviewed the weather data and emergency protocols. An Apache can handle severe weather conditions better than most aircraft in our fleet. The twin engines provide redundancy, and the advanced avionics can navigate in low visibility." Her voice remained steady despite the racing of her heart. Captain Rodriguez, a veteran pilot with 15 years of experience, leaned forward in his chair. "Maria, this isn't Afghanistan. There's no enemy fire to dodge, but Mother Nature doesn't negotiate or retreat. Hurricane winds can flip an Apache like a toy." The comment hung in the air, reflecting the sentiment of many in the room. Maria had proven herself in combat, successfully completing 47 missions with 0 casualties among her crews. She had extracted wounded soldiers under heavy enemy fire, provided close air support during ambushes, and earned 3 commendations for valor. But weather was an unpredictable enemy that couldn't be outmaneuvered or outgunned. "I appreciate the concern, Captain Rodriguez, but those oil rig workers don't have time for us to wait for better conditions. Every hour we delay increases their danger." Maria stood straighter, meeting the gaze of every person in the room. The Apache is designed for hostile environments. I've flown through sandstorms, monsoons, and enemy fire. This is just another challenge. The betting pool had evolved over the years as Maria continued to exceed expectations. Initially, soldiers wagered on when she would fail spectacularly. When that didn't happen, they bet on whether she would crack under the pressure of constant scrutiny. Some even wagered on how long it would take for her to request a transfer to a less demanding position. None of those bets had paid off. Colonel Harrison studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Very well, Captain. You'll take Apache 77 Alpha. Chief Warrant Officer Thompson will serve as your co-pilot and gunner." Thompson, a quiet man in his mid-30s with prematurely gray hair, had flown with Maria on 12 previous missions. He trusted her judgment and flying ability more than some pilots trusted their own instruments. As they walked toward the aircraft, he voiced the concern that others were thinking but hadn't said aloud. "You know, they're all waiting for you to prove them right," Thompson said quietly, checking his flight gear. "This mission is exactly the kind of situation they've been predicting would finally break you." Maria paused in her pre-flight checklist, looking at the Apache helicopter that would carry them into one of nature's most violent phenomena. The AH-64D Apache Longbow was a formidable machine, weighing nearly 12,000 pounds and capable of speeds exceeding 180 miles per hour. Its twin General Electric T700 turboshaft engines could produce over 3,400 horsepower combined, while advanced radar and navigation systems made it one of the most sophisticated helicopters in the world. "Let them bet against me," she replied, running her hand along the aircraft's armored fuselage. "I've been proving people wrong my entire career. This is just another Tuesday." The hurricane was still 8 hours away from making landfall, but its outer bands were already affecting weather patterns across the region. Wind gusts of 60 miles per hour rocked the helicopter as they completed their pre-flight inspection. Rain fell in sheets, making visibility difficult even on the ground. Inside the aircraft, Maria settled into the pilot's seat while Thompson took his position in the front gunner's compartment. The Apache's tandem seating arrangement placed the pilot higher and behind the co-pilot, providing better visibility for navigation and flight control. The sophisticated heads-up display showed weather radar, GPS coordinates, and flight parameters in bright green symbols. "Apache 77 Alpha, you are cleared for departure," came the voice of the control tower. "Be advised, weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. Current winds are gusting to 70 miles per hour, with conditions expected to worsen throughout the day." Maria acknowledged the clearance and slowly increased power to the twin turboshaft engines. The Apache lifted off smoothly despite the challenging winds, its advanced flight control systems automatically adjusting for gusts and turbulence. As they climbed to cruising altitude, the full scope of Hurricane Delilah became visible on the horizon. The storm was a massive spiral of clouds stretching across hundreds of miles, with a clearly defined eye wall that looked like a giant white donut against the dark sky. Lightning flickered continuously within the storm bands, creating an almost supernatural display of nature's power. Even from 50 miles away, the hurricane's influence was unmistakable in the increasing turbulence and changing wind patterns. Weather radar shows the storm is moving faster than initially predicted, Thompson reported, studying the instruments. "We'll have maybe 4 hours before conditions become completely impossible for any aircraft." The oil platform Delta 7 was located 60 miles offshore, positioned directly in the hurricane's projected path. Under normal circumstances, the flight would take approximately 30 minutes. Today, fighting against increasing headwinds and navigating around the storm's outer bands, the journey would take nearly twice as long. As they flew southeast toward the Gulf of Mexico, Maria reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. Growing up in a small Texas town, she had always been fascinated by aviation. Her father, a crop duster pilot, had taught her to fly small aircraft when she was 16. Military service offered the opportunity to fly the most advanced helicopters in the world, but it also meant constantly proving herself in a male-dominated field. The betting pool wasn't malicious, exactly. It was more like a running commentary on whether a woman could truly handle the same pressures and dangers as her male counterparts. Some soldiers genuinely believed gender differences would eventually manifest in critical situations. Others simply enjoyed the drama of watching someone try to exceed what they considered natural limitations. Approaching the coast, Thompson announced as the Gulf of Mexico came into view. The water below was already showing signs of the approaching hurricane, with waves reaching heights of 15 to 20 feet. White caps stretched to the horizon, and the normal blue-green color of the Gulf had turned an ominous gray-green. The wind conditions worsened dramatically as they moved over open water. Gusts now exceeded 80 miles per hour, causing the Apache to buck and roll despite its advanced stability systems. Maria's hands moved constantly on the controls, making dozens of micro-adjustments to maintain course and altitude. "This is just the beginning," she muttered to herself, watching the weather radar show increasingly dense precipitation ahead. The hurricane's outer bands were still 20 miles away, but their influence was already making flight extremely challenging. Platform Delta 7 appeared as a small speck on the horizon, barely visible through the driving rain and spray kicked up by the enormous waves. As they approached, the scope of the situation became clear. The oil rig was taking a beating from the storm surge, with waves washing completely over the lower decks. Emergency lights flashed through the gloom, indicating that power was still functioning, but there was no sign of human activity on the exposed platforms. "Can't see anyone outside," Thompson reported, scanning the structure through his targeting scope. All personnel must have taken shelter in the central housing unit. Landing on the platform would be impossible under current conditions. The helicopter pad was constantly washed by waves and buffeted by winds that would make any approach extremely dangerous. Maria circled the structure at a safe distance, looking for alternative options while fighting to maintain control in the increasingly violent weather. The situation was exactly what her critics had predicted would eventually overwhelm her. A dangerous rescue mission in impossible weather conditions, with 43 lives hanging in the balance and no clear solution in sight. The betting pool had always assumed that when faced with truly impossible circumstances, the pressure would finally prove too much. "We need to get closer to assess their condition," Maria announced, banking the Apache toward the platform despite the worsening conditions. "Those people are counting on us to find a way." As they approached through the driving rain and hurricane winds, both pilots knew they were entering a situation that would test every skill they had learned and every limit of their aircraft's capabilities. The real challenge was just beginning. The Apache helicopter shuddered violently as Maria fought to maintain position near platform Delta 7. Wind speeds had increased to 95 miles per hour, with gusts reaching 120. Every muscle in her body was engaged in keeping the aircraft stable enough for Thompson to assess the situation below. "I can see movement in the central housing unit," Thompson reported through the intercom, his voice strained as he braced against the turbulence. "Emergency lights are functioning, but the communication array appears to be damaged. No way to establish radio contact." Through the driving rain and sea spray, Maria could see that the platform was taking tremendous punishment. Waves were now reaching the second level of the structure, and several pieces of equipment had already been torn loose and swept away. The helicopter landing pad, their only hope for a direct rescue, was completely underwater with each wave surge. "We need to find another way," Maria said, banking the Apache away from the platform to reassess their options. The aircraft's advanced weather radar showed the eye of Hurricane Delilah was still 6 hours away, but the storm bands were intensifying rapidly. Within 2 hours, even their current position would become impossible to maintain. Back at Fort Campbell, the command center was monitoring their progress with growing concern. Colonel Harrison stood before a wall of monitors displaying weather data, satellite imagery, and real-time telemetry from the Apache helicopter. The numbers told a story that made experienced officers shake their heads in disbelief. Current wind speed at the platform is 105 miles per hour, reported the weather officer. Gusts are reaching 135. Those conditions exceed the operational limits of any rotary wing aircraft. Major Peterson, the operations officer, studied the radar displays showing the hurricane's progression. Even if Captain Santos locates the crew, extraction under these conditions would be impossible. We should recall the mission before we lose the helicopter and crew. The betting pool in the barracks had taken on a somber tone as word spread about the increasingly dangerous conditions. What had started as casual wagering about whether Maria would finally meet her match had evolved into genuine concern for two pilots flying into a natural disaster that was growing stronger by the hour. Sergeant Williams, who had made disparaging comments earlier, found himself watching the weather reports with unexpected anxiety. "She's actually trying to do it," he said to another soldier, "flying into hurricane winds that would ground every other pilot on base." Meanwhile, 60 miles offshore, Maria was discovering that the theoretical limits of the Apache helicopter were different from its practical capabilities in the hands of an exceptional pilot. The aircraft's twin T-700 engines were performing flawlessly despite the extreme conditions, and the advanced flight control systems were compensating for wind shears that would have been impossible to handle manually. "We need to get lower," Maria announced, beginning a careful descent toward the wave-toss platform. "If we can't land, maybe we can establish some kind of communication or assess their immediate needs." Thompson adjusted his position in the front seat, preparing to use the aircraft's optical systems to get a clearer view of the situation. As they dropped to within 50 feet of the platform, the full violence of the hurricane's power became apparent. The Apache was being tossed around like a leaf in a tornado, requiring constant pilot input to maintain any semblance of controlled flight. "There!" Thompson shouted over the noise of the engines and howling wind. "I can see people in the windows of the main shelter. They're waving something. Looks like a distress signal." The sight of the stranded workers gave Maria new determination, but it also highlighted the impossibility of their situation. The platform's emergency shelter was designed to withstand hurricane conditions, but it wasn't meant for extended occupation. The crew would have limited food, water, and medical supplies. If rescue didn't come soon, they would face life-threatening shortages. "Can you count how many people?" Maria asked, fighting to hold the helicopter steady enough for observation. "I see maybe 15 or 20 faces in the main window," Thompson replied, straining to see through the rain and spray. "But the platform houses 43 workers. The others must be in different sections of the shelter." As they hovered near the platform, Maria noticed something that changed everything. The structure's communication tower had been partially damaged, with the primary antenna array torn away by the wind. But the emergency backup antenna was still intact, though it appeared to be disconnected from the main power system. "Thompson, look at the backup communication system," she said, pointing toward a smaller antenna installation on the platform's upper level. "If we could somehow restore power to that antenna, they might be able to radio for additional rescue assets." The idea was ambitious to the point of being reckless. It would require landing on or very close to the platform under conditions that no helicopter pilot had ever attempted. The Apache would have to maintain position in hurricane force winds, while someone worked on electrical systems that were being constantly soaked by massive waves. "Maria, that's beyond dangerous," Thompson said carefully. "Even if we could somehow get close enough to the platform, working on electrical systems in these conditions would be suicide. One mistake, and we lose the helicopter, the crew, and any chance of helping those workers." But Maria was studying the platform layout with the intense focus that had earned her reputation as an innovative problem solver. The backup antenna system was located on a raised platform about 30 feet above the main deck. It would be periodically clear of the wave action, and the antenna itself appeared to be physically undamaged. "What if we don't try to land?" she said, an idea forming. "The Apache has a rescue hoist system. We could lower someone down to the antenna platform during the brief periods when it's clear of waves." Thompson was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. The rescue hoist was designed for picking up personnel from ground positions, not for inserting someone onto a storm-battered oil platform in hurricane conditions. The procedure would require precise timing, extraordinary flying skill, and more than a little luck. You're talking about threading a needle while riding a bucking bronco in a tornado, he said finally. The margin for error would be essentially zero. Back at Fort Campbell, the command center was receiving real-time telemetry from the Apache helicopter, but they couldn't see what Maria and Thompson were planning. The data showed that the aircraft was maintaining position near the platform despite conditions that should have made such flying impossible. "How is she holding position in those winds?" asked Major Peterson, staring at the displays in amazement. "The computer models say sustained flight in those conditions shouldn't be possible." Colonel Harrison had been watching the mission with growing respect for Captain Santos' flying ability. What had started as a routine reconnaissance mission had evolved into something far more complex and dangerous. The betting pool had always assumed that extreme conditions would expose some fundamental limitation in her capabilities. Instead, she was demonstrating skills that exceeded what most pilots thought possible. "She's not just surviving those conditions," the colonel observed. "She's actually maintaining controlled flight in winds that would ground any other pilot in our fleet." Meanwhile, at the oil platform, Maria was making calculations that combined meteorological data, aircraft performance specifications, and her own assessment of what might be achievable under impossible circumstances. "The Hurricane's Iwal would arrive in approximately 5 hours, bringing winds of 150 miles per hour or more. But for the next hour or two, the current conditions might represent a brief window of relative stability." "I'm going to try something," Maria announced, adjusting the Apache's position to approach the platform's antenna structure from the downwind side. "If I can use the platform itself as a windbreak, there might be a few seconds when the hoist operation would be possible." Thompson realized what she was planning and began preparing the rescue hoist system. The equipment was designed for combat search and rescue operations, with a steel cable capable of lifting 600 pounds and precise controls for lowering personnel to exact locations. Under normal conditions, the system was highly effective. In hurricane winds, it would be like trying to thread a needle while riding a roller coaster. "This has to be perfectly timed," Maria continued, studying the wave patterns and wind fluctuations. "When a large wave hits the platform, there's about a 3-second period when the antenna area is shielded from the worst wind. That's our window." The plan was forming in real time, driven by Maria's ability to see possibilities that others would dismiss as impossible. She had always been the pilot who found solutions when conventional wisdom said none existed. The betting pool had predicted that eventually she would encounter a situation where determination alone wouldn't be enough. This appeared to be that situation, but she was refusing to accept defeat. "I'll take the hoist down," Thompson said, understanding his role in the plan. "I've got electrical training from my civilian background. If the backup antenna just needs to be reconnected to power, I might be able to make it work." Maria positioned the Apache helicopter approximately 50 feet from the platform, using the structure's wind shadow to minimize buffeting. The timing would be critical. Too early, and Thompson would be lowered into a wall of wind and spray. Too late, and the window would close before he could reach the antenna platform. "Remember, you'll have maybe 10 seconds to assess the situation and another 10 seconds to make any repairs," she instructed. "At the first sign that conditions are deteriorating, I'm pulling you back up." Through the aircraft's communication system, they could hear radio chatter from the Fort Campbell Command Center, where officers were watching the mission with a combination of admiration and horror. No one had ever attempted a rescue operation in hurricane conditions, and the real-time data they were receiving showed flight parameters that seemed impossible. "Apache 77 Alpha, be advised that weather conditions are continuing to deteriorate," came the voice of the operations officer. "You are approaching the absolute limits of safe flight operations." Maria acknowledged the transmission, but continued her approach to the platform. She could see the stranded workers pressed against the windows of their shelter, watching the helicopter with expressions of hope and fear. They understood that this might be their only chance for rescue before the hurricane's full fury arrived. The first attempt to lower Thompson was unsuccessful. A sudden wind shear caught the Apache just as she was beginning the hoist operation, forcing her to abort and regain stable position. The second attempt was interrupted by a massive wave that sent spray 50 feet into the air, temporarily blinding both pilots. On the third attempt, everything came together. A large wave hit the platform at exactly the right moment, providing wind shadow just as Thompson reached the antenna platform. He had 12 seconds to assess the backup communication system, identify the problem, and attempt a repair that might enable the stranded workers to call for additional rescue assets. Got it. Thompson's voice crackled through the intercom. Main power cable was disconnected by the storm. I can reconnect it, but I need another few seconds. Maria fought to maintain position as another massive wave approached the platform, knowing that her co-pilot's life depended on precise timing and extraordinary flying skill in conditions that no helicopter pilot had ever faced. Thompson's hands moved with desperate efficiency as he worked to reconnect the severed power cable to the backup communication system. The antenna platform bucked and swayed beneath him as massive waves crashed against the oil rig's lower structures. Through his headset, he could hear Maria fighting to maintain the Apache's position in winds that were now gusting to 140 miles per hour. 30 seconds, Maria called out, watching another enormous wave building in the distance. I can see a big one coming that's going to send spray over the entire platform. The power connection was more complicated than Thompson had initially assessed. The storm hadn't simply disconnected a cable. It had damaged the junction box and scattered several critical components across the antenna platform. Working in hurricane winds while suspended from a helicopter cable, he had to essentially rebuild the electrical connection from scratch. Almost got it, he reported, forcing his rain-soaked fingers to manipulate the small electrical components. The junction box took a beating, but I think I can bypass the damaged sections. At Fort Campbell, the command center was receiving fragmentary reports about the rescue attempt, but the full scope of what Captain Santos was attempting remained unclear to the officers monitoring the mission. What they could see from the telemetry data was unprecedented, an Apache helicopter maintaining controlled flight in meteorological conditions that exceeded every known operational limit. "Sir, we're receiving reports from Coast Guard vessels in the area," announced the communications officer. They described seeing a military helicopter operating near Platform Delta 7 in conditions they characterize as impossible for aircraft operations. Colonel Harrison studied the real-time weather data streaming across multiple monitors. Wind speeds at the platform location had exceeded 130 miles per hour, with wave heights reaching 40 feet. According to every manual and regulation, no aircraft should be capable of sustained flight under such conditions. How was she doing it? Major Peterson asked, genuinely bewildered by what the data was showing. The Apache's operational limits are clearly defined. Those conditions should have grounded any helicopter hours ago. The answer lay in Maria's unique combination of exceptional flying skill, intimate knowledge of the Apache's capabilities, and absolute refusal to accept defeat when lives were at stake. She had spent 6 years learning every nuance of helicopter flight, pushing the boundaries of what was considered possible while her critics waited for her to finally encounter insurmountable obstacles. Connection restored, Thompson announced triumphantly as the backup antenna system came to life. Emergency lights on the communication array began blinking, indicating that power was flowing and the system was attempting to establish contact with rescue coordination centers. Maria immediately began pulling Thompson back up to the helicopter, racing against time as the approaching wave built to a height that would engulf the entire antenna platform. The rescue hoist reeled in cable at maximum speed while she simultaneously fought to maintain position and altitude in the chaotic wind conditions. "I'm clear of the platform," Thompson reported as he was lifted back into the aircraft. Below them, the massive wave crashed over the oil rig with tremendous force, sending spray and debris high into the air. If the timing had been off by even a few seconds, the mission would have ended in disaster. Almost immediately, their radio crackled to life with an emergency transmission from Platform Delta 7. The backup communication system was working, and the stranded workers were able to establish contact for the first time in over 8 hours. "This is Platform Delta 7 calling any rescue units," came a desperate voice through the static. "We have 43 personnel in emergency shelter. We got injured crew members, and our food and water supplies are running critically low. Storm surge is reaching the second level of our structure." Maria responded immediately, identifying their Apache helicopter and requesting detailed information about the crew's condition and immediate needs. The news wasn't encouraging. 3 workers had been injured when equipment broke loose during the storm's initial approach, and the platform's emergency supplies were designed for a 12-hour crisis, not an extended hurricane siege. "Medical attention is urgent for at least 2 personnel," the platform's supervisor reported, "and our shelter is taking structural damage. We're not sure how much longer it will hold against the increasing wave action." The successful restoration of communications represented a critical breakthrough, but it also highlighted the growing urgency of the situation. The workers were in immediate danger, and conventional rescue operations remained impossible under current weather conditions. The hurricane's eye wall was still 3 hours away, bringing winds that would make even their current impossible mission completely suicidal. "Thompson, can you reach the Coast Guard Coordination Center?" Maria asked, beginning to formulate a new plan that was even more ambitious than their antenna repair mission. "We need to coordinate with every available rescue asset in the region." Within minutes, Thompson had established communication with Coast Guard Sector New Orleans, the primary coordination center for Gulf of Mexico rescue operations. The response to their report was a mixture of admiration and alarm. No one had attempted helicopter operations in such extreme conditions, and the Coast Guard's most experienced flight crews had been grounded hours earlier. "Apache 77 Alpha, be advised that all Coast Guard air assets are currently grounded due to weather conditions," the Coordination Center reported. "You are the only aircraft operating in the affected area. What are your intentions?" Maria stared through the rain-lashed windscreen at Platform Delta 7, where 43 people were trapped in a structure that was being systematically destroyed by Hurricane Delilah. The betting pool back at Fort Campbell had always assumed that eventually she would face a situation where determination and skill wouldn't be enough. This appeared to be that situation, but she was discovering resources within herself that even she hadn't known existed. "Coast Guard, this is Apache 77 Alpha," she transmitted. "We're going to attempt personnel extraction from Platform Delta 7. I need you to coordinate with Fort Campbell for emergency medical support and prepare for incoming casualties." The silence on the radio frequency was telling. What Captain Santos was proposing was beyond dangerous. It was a rescue operation that violated every established protocol for helicopter safety. The Apache was a combat aircraft, not a search and rescue platform, and attempting to extract 43 people from a storm-battered oil platform in hurricane conditions was unprecedented in military aviation history. "Maria, how are we going to extract 43 people?" Thompson asked, voicing the question that everyone was thinking. "The Apache can carry maybe 6 or 8 passengers under emergency conditions, and that's in normal weather." The solution was forming in Maria's mind as she studied the platform layout and considered the aircraft's capabilities. The Apache's external cargo hook system was designed for lifting equipment and supplies, but it could potentially be adapted for emergency personnel transport. The platform's crew quarters included life rafts and emergency flotation equipment that could be rigged for helicopter transport. "We're not going to extract them all at once," she explained, her voice calm despite the enormity of what she was proposing. "We'll take the most critically injured first, using the external hook system to lift emergency rafts. Multiple trips, time between wave surges." Thompson processed the implications of the plan, realizing that Maria was proposing to conduct multiple landing and takeoff operations in conditions that were already at the limits of what was survivable. Each trip would require precision flying that exceeded anything attempted in military aviation history. That's at least 6 or 7 trips in hurricane conditions that are getting worse every hour, he calculated. By the time we're making the final extractions, we'll be flying in winds approaching 150 miles per hour. But Maria had made her decision. The workers on Platform Delta 7 represented more than just a rescue mission. They embodied every challenge she had faced throughout her military career. Critics had always assumed that eventually she would encounter a situation that would prove the limitations they expected to find. Instead of limitations, she was discovering capabilities that surprised even herself. Platform Delta 7, this is Apache 77 Alpha, she transmitted. We're going to get you off that platform. I need you to prepare your most critically injured personnel for immediate extraction. Gather life rafts and emergency flotation equipment. We'll be conducting multiple extraction flights over the next 2 hours. The response from the platform was a mixture of disbelief and desperate hope. No one on the oil rig had expected that rescue would be possible under current conditions. The sight of the Apache helicopter maintaining position in hurricane winds had seemed like a hallucination, and the possibility of actual evacuation bordered on miraculous. Back at Fort Campbell, news of Captain Santos' rescue plan was spreading through the base with lightning speed. The betting pool that had followed her career for 6 years was forgotten as soldiers gathered around radio equipment and television monitors, following the most dangerous helicopter rescue mission ever attempted. She's actually going to try it, Sergeant Williams said with a mixture of awe and fear. Multiple extractions from an oil platform in hurricane conditions. I've never heard of anything like this being attempted. Colonel Harrison was coordinating with higher command authorities, requesting additional medical support and emergency resources for what could become either a tremendous rescue success or a devastating aircraft loss. The mission was receiving attention from Pentagon officials who recognized that they were witnessing something unprecedented in military aviation. Sir, we have Department of Defense officials requesting real-time updates, reported the communications officer. This operation is being monitored at the highest levels. At Platform Delta 7, the oil rig workers were preparing for an evacuation that they had never expected to be possible. The platform supervisor, a 30-year veteran of offshore operations, had experienced numerous hurricanes and emergency evacuations. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for watching a military helicopter attempting rescue operations in Category 4 hurricane conditions. I've never seen flying like this, he told his crew as they prepared emergency equipment. That pilot is doing things that shouldn't be possible. Maria positioned the Apache for the first extraction attempt, focusing her entire being on the task ahead. The winds were now consistently above 135 miles per hour, with gusts reaching 155. Wave heights had increased to 45 feet, and the platform was taking increasingly severe structural damage from the constant pounding. First extraction group ready, came the radio call from the platform. 2 injured personnel secured an emergency raft with medical supplies. The betting pool had always assumed that extreme conditions would eventually overwhelm her. Instead, Maria Santos was about to demonstrate that the only real limitations were the ones people imposed on themselves. The most dangerous phase of the mission was just beginning, and she was discovering that her capabilities extended far beyond what anyone, including herself, had ever imagined possible. The first extraction attempt would determine whether the impossible rescue mission could actually succeed. Maria maneuvered the Apache helicopter into position above Platform Delta 7, fighting winds that now exceeded 145 miles per hour with gusts approaching 160. The aircraft's advanced flight control systems were working at maximum capacity, making hundreds of adjustments per second to maintain any semblance of stable flight. Emergency raft is ready for pickup, reported the platform supervisor. 2 injured crew members secured inside with emergency medical supplies. Through the driving rain and sea spray, Maria could see the small yellow life raft positioned on the platform's upper deck. The oil rig workers had rigged it with additional flotation devices and secured the injured personnel inside with emergency harnesses. The raft represented hope for 43 people trapped in a structure that was being systematically destroyed by Hurricane Delilah. Beginning hook deployment, Thompson announced, activating the Apache's external cargo system. The steel cable began descending toward the platform, but the hurricane winds immediately caught it, causing it to swing wildly despite the aircraft's sophisticated stabilization systems. Maria's hands moved constantly on the controls, making minute adjustments to counter wind shears and turbulence that would have overwhelmed any other pilot. The bedding pullback at Fort Campbell had always assumed that eventually she would encounter conditions that would exceed her capabilities. Instead, she was discovering that her limits extended far beyond what anyone had imagined possible. "Cable is drifting too far east," Thompson observed, watching the hook swing away from the target raft. "Wind shear is stronger than our compensation systems can handle." The solution required a flying technique that didn't exist in any manual. Maria began a complex hover pattern that used the Apache's forward momentum to counteract the wind's effect on the cargo cable. The maneuver required her to essentially fly the helicopter in a controlled drift while maintaining precise altitude and position relative to the moving target below. "That's it," Thompson called out as the cargo hook settled near the life raft. "Platform crew is attaching the lift cable now." The oil rig workers moved with desperate efficiency, securing the life raft to the Apache's cargo hook system while massive waves continued to crash over the platform. They had perhaps 30 seconds before another surge would sweep across the deck, making the pickup impossible. "Raft is secure," came the radio transmission from below. "Two injured personnel ready for extraction." Maria immediately began climbing, lifting the life raft and its precious cargo away from the oil platform just as another enormous wave crashed over the structure. The Apache struggled to gain altitude while carrying the external load in hurricane-force winds, but the 2,700 engines provided enough power to overcome the extraordinary conditions. First extraction successful, she reported to both the Fort Campbell Command Center and the Coast Guard Coordination Center. Two injured personnel en route to medical facilities, beginning transit to mainland for emergency medical treatment. The flight back to the Louisiana coast took 45 minutes fighting headwinds that approached 130 miles per hour. Emergency medical teams were waiting at the designated landing zone, where the injured oil rig workers received immediate treatment for injuries sustained during the storm. Both men would make full recoveries, but their rescue represented just the beginning of Maria's unprecedented mission. Apache 77 Alpha, outstanding work on the first extraction, came the voice of Colonel Harrison from Fort Campbell. Be advised that weather conditions are continuing to deteriorate. Hurricane Delilah's eye wall will reach platform Delta 7 in approximately 90 minutes. The timeline was becoming critical. 41 people remained trapped on the oil platform, and the approaching eye wall would bring winds exceeding 150 miles per hour. Under such conditions, even Maria's extraordinary flying skills would be insufficient to maintain controlled flight. The rescue mission had become a race against time and nature's most violent forces. "Thompson, how are our fuel and systems holding up?" Maria asked as they prepared for the return flight to the platform. "All systems are performing within normal parameters despite the extreme conditions," he replied, checking the aircraft's status displays. "Fuel consumption is higher than normal due to fighting headwinds, but we have enough for at least 4 more round trips." The second extraction was even more challenging than the first. Wind speeds had increased to 150 miles per hour sustained, with gusts reaching 170. The wave heights now exceeded 50 feet, and platform Delta 7 was taking structural damage that threatened its integrity. Several support pillars showed signs of stress fractures, and portions of the lower deck had been completely destroyed by the relentless wave action. "Platform Delta 7, what's your status?" Maria called as they approached for the second pickup. "We've lost power to sections of the shelter. came the increasingly desperate reply. Water is entering the main quarters, and we're not sure how much longer the structure will hold. We need to evacuate immediately. Maria could see the platform's deteriorating condition through the storm. What had been a stable industrial structure hours earlier was now a battered hulk fighting for survival against Hurricane Delilah's increasing fury. The workers had prepared 6 more personnel for the second extraction, including an elderly crew member who required immediate medical attention. The second pickup required even more precise flying than the first attempt. The platform was now moving significantly with each wave impact, rising and falling as much as 20 feet as massive swells passed underneath. Timing the cargo hook deployment required Maria to predict the platform's movement while simultaneously fighting winds that exceeded the Apache's theoretical operational limits. "I can see why they bet against you," Thompson said with admiration as Maria executed a perfect hookup despite conditions that defied description. "This is flying that goes beyond training or experience. This is pure instinct and determination." The comment reminded Maria of the betting pool that had followed her military career for 6 years. Soldiers had wagered on when she would finally encounter a situation that would prove the limitations they expected to find in a female combat pilot. Instead of limitations, she was discovering capabilities that surprised everyone, including herself. Back at Fort Campbell, the command center had become a focal point for military officials from across the region. Word of Captain Santos' hurricane rescue mission had reached the Pentagon, where senior officers were monitoring the unprecedented operation in real time. "Sir, we're receiving reports from multiple Coast Guard vessels in the area," announced the operations officer. They described flying conditions as beyond extreme, with sustained winds exceeding 150 miles per hour. They're calling it the most dangerous helicopter rescue ever attempted. The second extraction was successful, bringing 6 more oil platform workers to safety despite conditions that continued to worsen. But time was running out. The hurricane's eye wall was now less than an hour away, bringing winds that would make continued flight operations impossible even for a pilot of Maria's extraordinary capabilities. "Third extraction ready," reported Platform Delta 7. 8 personnel prepared for pickup, but we're running out of time. Structure is showing major stress fractures. The third and fourth extractions became increasingly desperate affairs. Maria was now flying in conditions that exceeded every known limit for rotary wing aircraft operations. Wind speeds approached 160 miles per hour sustained, with gusts that registered off the scale of measuring devices. The Apache helicopter was being tossed around like a toy, requiring constant pilot input to maintain any semblance of controlled flight. "Maria, I need to know if you want to abort the mission," Thompson said during the fourth extraction. "We're approaching the eye wall, and conditions are becoming impossible." Through the hurricane's chaos, Maria could see the faces of the remaining workers pressed against the windows of the collapsing shelter. 19 people still remained on Platform Delta 7, and she knew that this might be their last chance for rescue before the hurricane's full fury made any aircraft operations completely suicidal. "We're getting them all out," she replied with absolute determination. "Every single person on that platform is going home." The fifth extraction was completed just as the first bands of the hurricane's eye wall began to arrive. Winds now exceeded 165 miles per hour, and the Apache helicopter was operating at the very limits of what was physically possible. The platform was breaking apart, with entire sections of the structure collapsing into the turbulent Gulf waters. "Final extraction ready," came the last radio transmission from Platform Delta 7. 11 personnel remaining. Platform structural integrity is critical. As Maria positioned the Apache for the final pickup, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The betting pool had always assumed that extreme conditions would eventually overwhelm her, that her gender would somehow manifest as a limitation in critical situations. Instead, she had discovered that determination, skill, and absolute refusal to accept defeat could overcome obstacles that others considered insurmountable. The final extraction required flying skills that transcended normal human capabilities. Maria was operating in a zone where training merged with instinct, where years of experience combined with extraordinary natural ability to accomplish the impossible. The Apache helicopter responded to her control inputs as if it were an extension of her own body, maintaining position in winds that should have torn any aircraft apart. Final group is secure. Thompson called out as the last life raft lifted away from the disintegrating platform. All personnel successfully extracted. As they climbed away from platform Delta 7 for the final time, both pilots watched the oil rig finally succumb to Hurricane Delilah's assault. The structure that had housed 43 workers collapsed into the storm-tossed Gulf waters just minutes after the last rescue was completed. Apache 77 Alpha, this is Fort Campbell Command, came Colonel Harrison's voice over the radio. Outstanding work, Captain Santos. You've just completed the most dangerous helicopter rescue mission in military history. All 43 oil platform workers are safe thanks to your extraordinary flying. The return flight to the mainland was a triumphant victory lap through the hurricane's diminishing outer bands. Behind them, Hurricane Delilah continued its destructive path toward the Louisiana coast, but 43 families would be reunited because one pilot had refused to accept that some things were impossible. At Fort Campbell, the betting pool had been officially closed. No one was wagering against Captain Maria Santos anymore. She had proven beyond any doubt that limitations existed only in the minds of those who imposed them on themselves and others. The woman who was supposed to crack under pressure had instead redefined what was possible in the face of nature's most violent forces. In the aftermath of Hurricane Delilah, Maria's rescue mission became the subject of military aviation textbooks and congressional commendations. But for her, the greatest satisfaction came from knowing that 43 people had gone home to their families because she had refused to accept defeat when others said success was impossible. The betting had ended, but Captain Maria Santos' legend was just beginning.